Hey everybody, welcome to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. Today we are joined with Carmen Imes. We're talking about being God's image. I did it. I said right at the beginning I wasn't going to do it, and I did it. It's going to be an exciting program. You guys stay tuned. You are watching the Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Roundtree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you. Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in today. One of our favorite guests is back with us again to discuss her new book, Being God's Image, not Bearing God's Image. The last book is Bearing God's Name. So she even warns in the book, like, hey, and also look how cool it is to have perks to be the Remnant Radio guys. This is like a non-published version. Am I narking you, Carmen, when I say that? Like, are you gonna get in trouble with your publisher when I say, hey, look, I got this? Okay, cool. This unedited one. Anyway, I'm totally holding on to this. I don't know. I'd love to think that it's gonna be worth a bunch one day because it's like one of those cool ones that didn't get released. You need to get your copy of it. You can pre-order it now if it's not released. It should be released really soon, right, Carmen?
Mm-hmm. Yep, June 6th.
I have people in my church who've already pre-ordered it, so I know that that's an option, so people can go out and check it out. It's a fantastic book. You want to pick it up. Anyway, before we dive into all of that, even though I'm diving into it already, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button if you want to support the channel. We're crowdfunded. Links in the description. You can give a one-time gift on PayPal or a recurring gift on Patreon. If you give as low as $5 a month, you have access to extra content. Without further ado, Roundtree, you excited about today's show?
I'm excited about today's show, man. Being God's image. There's so much debate over God's image and what it means for us. And we'll dive into all those different nuances. So definitely excited, but even more than the topic, excited about Dr. Imes being on the show. A great scholar and also articulate and able to communicate God's truth in a powerful way, and a friend of Remnant Radio. So Carmen, it's great to have you.
We were all at ETS. I don't know if you remember this, Michael. You had buyer's remorse at ETS because me and Miller were like, we went to Carmen Imes, and he was like, wait, Carmen had an in session at ETS, and we are like, yeah, and it was fantastic. We just started showing you the notes, and you could see Michael's soul kind of leave his body, like, oh no. Yeah. ETS is one of the most psychologically challenging things to do. You show up and you've got like 30 lectures, maybe 100 lectures to pick from. It's ridiculous, but it is by far the best presentation that me and Miller got to experience. So thank you for that. Anyway, without just stroking your ego and building you up super much, tell us about yourself and your ministry for people who don't know about you, Carmen.
Sure. So I'm Associate Professor of Old Testament at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University in Southern California. This is we've just finished our semester, the end of my second year here at Biola. I've got amazing colleagues and great students. It's been a lot of fun here teaching Old Testament. I also have a YouTube channel called Torah Tuesday, where I release weekly videos, usually on Exodus. I'm writing a commentary on Exodus for Baker Academic. That's what my ETS paper was about, was the literary patterning in the plague narratives in Exodus and how it helps us anticipate and frames for us the death of the firstborn. So lots from me on Exodus. This new book is a bit of a change of pace because it's mostly on Genesis and then tracing the themes of image of God through the rest of the Bible.
When does the Exodus book come out? Because again, like, I want to give a snippet for people who don't know what I'm talking about here. Like you showed the parallels. Well, first of all, like you resituated the plagues. Not all of them are called plagues, even though we call them plagues.
Right.
You talked about the snake and the staffs being swallowed up, and Pharaoh and his armories being swallowed up, and how those are parallels and bookends. Like the way that you framed it was just very punchy, but like also, how did we miss all of this? Anyway, so people need to check out your book because I'm very excited. Even the couple chapters that you reviewed at ETS was super helpful. I've passed on the paperwork of your presentation to people again in my church who enjoy your work. So yeah. And when does that come out?
I don't know, Josh, when it's coming out. So I just hit 32% of my word count. Not that I'm actually counting that closely. I like every day I'm like, okay, recalculating. Okay, I'm at 32%. And I think it'll probably be 3 years before it's on the shelves, but I am working hard on it every day.
You and Keener both were like, hey, when do we get Mark? And he's like, No telling. Like it's I'm working on it, but you
Yeah.
just wait. I guess writing commentaries takes a
Okay.
lot of extra work. I don't know. That's weird. Anyway, so
Yeah,
tell us
so it's
about.
two.
Wait, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's a 250,000 word project, which is like 2.5 dissertations, and the dissertation took me 5 years. So if I get the commentary done in 6 years, that'll be like lightning speed. So
That
Yeah.
I have a hard time writing Facebook posts. So anyway, tell us about bearing God's image. I'm interested to jump into the subject matter. Your cover
Being
is
God's image.
similar. Wait, what was that, Roundtree?
Being God's image, you mean?
Yeah, I did meaning. I'm gonna.
that is what
It's gonna be
he
an
meant.
accident this entire time.
Yeah,
And why is it important that it's being God's image and not bearing God's image?
yeah.
If they were all bearing titles, we could keep it all
Oh,
straight. Now I know you mentioned it in your book,
yeah.
but dive into this book and let's get going with
Sure.
it.
Yeah, so we have two reasons why it's going to be hard to remember the title of my book. One, because the first book was called Bearing God's Name, so I'm already associated with that, and so people already are thinking of bearing when they think of me. But the other reason is because we often talk about bearing God's image. It's probably the second most common way of talking about it. People talk about being made in the image or bearing God's image, and then they talk about imaging God. And I actually argue in the book that I don't think that these are quite right. And that's why I picked this title deliberately, Being God's Image, because I'm convinced that the image of God is not something extra that we carry with us. It's not additional to us, but it's actually our human identity. And it's the core of who we are. So we are the image of God, which is why I try not to say being made in the image of God or bear the image or imaging, because all of those put us at one step removed from the image, or they make the image something that we do rather than someone that we are. And that, I think, is really important when we begin working things out ethically.
Okay, so talk to us about. So we're introduced to the image of God in Genesis chapter 1, right in the creation narrative, and
Mhm.
you talk in your book about just the flow of the 7 days as being this sort of liturgy, and that we're still in the seventh day, and the creation narrative also being connected with sort of a polemical trash talk against the Babylonians. I love how the Jewish people always got to get a little smack talk in against their enemies, but there's so much happening in this creation story. How does that inform our understanding of what it means to be God's image?
Yeah, great question, Michael. This chapter, Genesis 1, I call the battleground of Christian debate over creation. And so it's actually a bit risky to start a book talking about Genesis 1, because people are listening very carefully to see if I'm going to say it the way their pastor says it, or if I'm going to say it the way they see it. And if I don't, then the book gets tossed out and I
How
get
old's the
painted
earth,
as.
Carmen? How old is the earth?
So, yes. So, what I try to do in the book is ask people to set aside for a moment the question of how God made the earth long enough to consider why God made the earth.
Mhm.
And I believe that Genesis 1, regardless of whether or not it has information about how, it's very deliberate in showing us why God made the earth. And so the first chapter is set up. I use the word liturgy. Not everyone's familiar with the word liturgy. A liturgy or a liturgical service is a service that's where the spoken parts of the service are very carefully planned out, thought through, and articulated in advance. And so if you go to a church where you read from the Book of Common Prayer, that's a liturgy. And Genesis 1 reads like it's been meant to be read aloud, like it's a celebration of God's creative work. And it's very carefully stylized. So rather than, I don't think what we're seeing is an FYI, or just so you know, this is what happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, as if it's some kind of a journalistic report, but rather
Mhm.
an unfolding celebration of God's creative work that brings order to the universe. So we have this really cool symmetry between days 1 through 3 and days 4 through 6, where in days 1 through 3, God creates domains or realms in which life can flourish. And then in days 4, 5, and 6, he populates those realms with residents. So I never noticed this, even though I grew up in the church and read Genesis lots of times. I never noticed that you have light and dark on day 1 and then sun, moon, and stars on day 4. The sun, moon, and stars are actually the residents of the light and the dark, and they rule over it. They rule over the day and the night. And then on day 2, you have sky and water, and then you have fish and birds populating it on day 5. And so when we pay attention to the structure and the order of the chapter, it helps us to see that Yahweh is a God who brings order to creation, brings order out of disorder. And the very last entity he makes is humanity. And humanity is told to rule over the rest of creation. And the implication is that we carry on God's creative work by maintaining order and maintaining space for human and animal and plant flourishing on creation. And so I think if we pay attention to the structure of the chapter, it helps us to see the significance of humans being made last.
Okay. And then within that, you talk a little bit about the smack talk to the Babylonians. Can you elaborate on that? And does that
Sure.
have any bearing on being God's image?
Sure. So it's very interesting to set the Bible alongside ancient Near Eastern myths, because sometimes we come to the Bible thinking that it's here to answer our questions, and we use it as a weapon against the modern day myths about creation, such as evolution or whatever. So we try to bring it into science debates, and it's our conversation partner, but it's not actually written to answer modern debates or written over and against modern debates. It's written over and against Babylonian and Egyptian ideas about how the world came to be. And what you find when you read those texts, those myths, is that there's a lot of conflict, and there's death and fighting among the gods. And there's various elements we could talk about. One that stands out to me is that the gods' reason for making humans in the Babylonian myth, the Enuma Elish, is so that humans would do their dirty work so the gods could just hang out and rest. And the gods didn't want to have to work so hard, so they could just laze around all day while humans did their work for them. And that's such a different picture than what we get in Genesis 1, where God is the one bringing order, and then he appoints us to rule on his behalf, but you don't ever get the sense that he's off taking a nap somewhere. Instead, the idea is that humans are the physical embodiment, physical reminder of God's rule. And so we're participating with him in ruling over creation. So rather than working as his slaves, we're working as his ambassadors, which is a totally different ballgame.
Yeah, and you mentioned that God has he has populated on different days. Okay, the air, the sky, the sea, fish, birds, animals, living creatures. We are obviously in some sense living, breathing creatures. We have life, but in what way are we different in that we carry God's image that they don't? And in what way is that?
Sure. So what's interesting is that animals are also created and told that they're supposed to be fruitful and increase in number. I'm looking at Genesis 1:22, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas, let the birds increase on the earth. So animals are also supposed to multiply. So we can't take procreation as the basis for what makes humans different than the rest of creation. The different part is the rulership, that humans are given dominion over creation, that we're supposed to not only fill the earth, but also subdue it. And I think it's really striking, and I talk about this in the book, that male and female are both the image of God, both told to rule, and neither is told to rule over each other. And in the same vein, men are not told to rule over other men. Like humans don't dominate each other in Genesis 1. The ruling and subduing that happens is ruling and subduing the rest of creation. And so it seems like that rulership is a very important part of it. It's not identical to the image, but it's an important implication of the image. Those who are God's image, those who have that human identity, have this job to do.
Okay, well let's talk
Go
about
ahead.
that job. When Josh, did I cut you off?
Oh no, I think
Okay.
you and I were going to ask the same question. So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that job. So that sort of, some people will talk about like the image of God being vocational. You do this thing, you subdue the earth. You obviously see some kind of link there. But there are other ways of viewing the image of God. And of course, it's kind of right there in your title,
Mhm.
being God's image. And so we kind of have this,
Mhm.
there, there's a being and there's a doing, and clearly the doing flows out of the
Mhm.
being. But in terms of the essence, what we would call our ontology,
Yes.
of being in God's image, what is the relationship between that and the commission to subdue
Mhm.
the earth, to bring
Yes.
order to the earth, to bring it under our dominion, to take the raw
Mhm.
materials and organize them in
Yeah.
order, just as God did? So, what's the
Yeah.
relationship between that and the first part? I could tell you're ready to answer this, so go for it.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you asked this, Michael, because I think many people confuse the rulership with the image. The rulership is an implication of the image, but it's not the image. And the reason why this is important is because if we tie the image to human capacity, then then someone who's more able-bodied becomes more the image of God than someone who's not. And so it to me, it's really crucially important for our ethics that we affirm, as scripture does, that male and female are the image of God, full stop. And that the being then flows out into potential action, but the action is not the image. The ontological truth is that we are the image, and then there's functional implications of that get worked out. And so often throughout the history of the church, people have talked about the image of God as a either particular function or capacity. So one of the really common ones that's cited is rationality. If someone is rational, well, okay, so first of all, people approach the question with what's the difference between humans and animals? If we could figure out the difference between humans and animals, then that would tell us what the imago Dei, or the image of God, really is. And I think it's interesting to consider what's different between humans and animals, but I want to be tied exegetically to the biblical text and ground the concept of the imago Dei in what the text says about it, not what I can discern metaphysically that is a difference between me and an animal. So, yes, humans on average are more rational than animals. I'm not disputing that. And I would say there is something qualitatively different about the kind of rationality we have, self-consciousness, etc. But I still wouldn't ground the image of God in our rationality, because if we do that, then we come up with a sliding scale of people who are more or less the image of God. So if you have a higher IQ, does that make you more the image of God? If I tomorrow got in a car accident and was in a coma, have I lost the image of God? And I would argue no. Someone who's in a coma, someone who's born with severe developmental disabilities, someone who undergoes
Someone who's
an
unborn.
aging. Sure, someone who's unborn, someone who experiences dementia in their old age, all of these are full-fledged human beings. We don't have any sliding scale. If you have a body, you are human. If you have a human body, you are human. Therefore, you are the image of God. Full stop.
That's okay. So if you're a human, you are in the image of God. Full stop. Um, does that? And my question would be, we're going to kind of dip into another part of the conversation we haven't maybe discussed yet. But the idea that ancient Near Eastern cultures would have this kind of temple, and within the
Mm-hmm.
temple there would be
Mm-hmm.
an image bearer.
Yes.
We call it an icon, or like a statue of
Idol.
Zeus that would be inside
Yep.
of Zeus's temple,
Yep.
right? So some kind of idol that was present that would bear his image, and there'd also be oftentimes the spirit of that god would embody that image, that statue, that idol,
Yeah.
to communicate to people in that worldview, ancient Near East
Yep.
kind of space, and it's not unique just to Jewish or Babylonian. Like it seems to be a kind of cohesive thought in lots of different mythologies. So
Yeah.
in that being said, I imagine Adam, he has got this image. He is bearing this image. He is the icon or the idol of God in this tabernacle setting. Does his physiology, because again, I think the same question would come, well, there are some people who are born without an arm or lose an arm or a leg. Are they less God's image? But I also don't want the internal stuff and the occupational things to determine what makes us God's image, because that kind of sounds Gnostic, right? Our embodied physicalness has something to do with that as well. So could you maybe speak into, again, deformities and or horrible accidents where people lose a ligament? Does that make them less God's image? I don't think that's exclusively what it means to be God's image either, right?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the ancient Near Eastern concept of an image, because this is also where we get really off track and where a lot of conversations about the image of God center in on some kind of intangible thing about humans and say this is the image, when actually the Hebrew word tselem is something very concrete. As you said, an idol or a statue, that's what that word means. If you build a temple, put an idol in the holy place, that idol is the tselem. And when God makes the world and brings order to it, he installs humanity as his physical tselem, as his physical representatives. We are signals of the presence of God in the way that an idol is a signal of a God's presence. So I think that is just really helpful. There's been so many centuries where people have talked about this in a kind of theological vacuum without reference to the archaeological discoveries of the ancient Near East or to even the textual history of the ancient Near East. And now we know better. We've dug up things that say, physical idol that says tselem on it. And so we know better now. And so we can get away from, I think, what's been a rabbit trail that was unhelpful in the history of interpretation by generations that didn't have access to what we have access to now. Their libraries were not what our libraries are, and the discoveries hadn't all been made yet. And so we're in some senses closer now to the biblical past than people had for over 1,000 years in between the time of the New Testament and now. There was a period of time when a lot of this information was lost. The Hebrew language was lost, and these things have been recovered in ways that I think are helpful. So, Josh, you asked about losing a limb. One thing that's helpful to know about the way images worked in the ancient Near East is that they didn't think that the image didn't have to exactly match the deity. I'm thinking of an example of where a king, so this is slightly different than idolatry, but there's a scenario in which a king of an ancient Near Eastern, maybe Mesopotamian culture, there's a prophecy about the king that he's going to be killed, that some disaster is going to befall the nation and he's going to lose his life. They would go through this special ceremony. I can't remember off the top of my head what it's called, but this replacement king would be installed. So they would unking the real king for a while, and they would get a replacement person in that role until the disaster happened. And so that king would die, and then they could put the real king back in office. And the replacement king did not have to look exactly like the real king. There were certain features that communicated kingship: a certain hairstyle, a certain headdress, a certain kind of hem on your robe, certain symbols that you wore. And so you could have a replacement king who's missing a limb or whose face is disfigured, and that wouldn't matter to the project of replacing or representing the king. I think the same thing works with humans as God representatives. We don't have a certain, it's not like you have to have 10 fingers and 10 toes for this to work. The fact that we're embodied, generally speaking, we share certain characteristics that supersedes the loss of any one particular characteristic. Does that make sense?
So physiology does have something to do with being God's image, like my physical human.
Yes.
And I think that's really important personally.
Yes.
Because I think that pushes against Gnostic ideas that
it does.
Seeming like somehow coming back into the church somehow. But then also Jesus came in this image, like he came in human flesh.
Yes.
Like the
Yes.
physical stuff matters. He will forever have flesh
Yep.
stuff. Like that's
Yeah.
really important, I think, to
Right.
the narrative of what it is to be human. So
But at
Yeah,
the same
I'm
time,
thankful for that
absolutely.
answer.
But at the same time, you're not suggesting that, say, God the Father is like a real embodied human like,
Mm,
well,
mm.
human like, we'd have to define that. You wouldn't
Yeah,
describe
yeah.
God the Father as embodied, correct?
Yeah, I would not. The Old Testament is full of metaphorical language about God, where there's anthropomorphic language. It talks about God's hand, God's nose, God's eyes,
His wings.
God's arm, his wings. Yes. So
His
I
feathers.
I right, his feathers. There's lots of metaphor, and there is debate about the body of God in the Old Testament. But I think part of the point of God wanting humans to be his embodied representatives is because God himself is not embodied. And so humans have
Mm,
a kind of physicality that God does not have, that we're able to spread out. To part of filling the earth is to have representatives of God in all the places. But I
mm,
agree, Josh, that the physicality matters so much, and we live in a very interesting season in which Gnosticism is back on the rise again, in which Christians actually talk about their eternal destiny in disembodied ways. We talk about going to heaven when we die, and we don't talk enough about physical embodied resurrection. And we've lost the significance of the physical incarnation of Jesus. If these bodies were just temporary shells that hold the real us, and that someday they'll be buried and the real us will ascend to be in some disembodied place, then Jesus did not have to come in a body. He could have come and helped us with an exodus out of these shells that we're in. But instead, Jesus comes in a body. He
mhm,
dies in his body, and his bodily raised. His body is resurrected. He still has scars from his
mhm,
crucifixion, which tells us that there's continuity between his physical body and his resurrected body. And I think this is tremendously important for how we think about our future. And then by implication, for how we think about the way we treat our bodies now, the way we think about embodiment now. Josh, you
mhm,
mentioned the unborn. I think this, I wasn't setting out to make a pro life argument when I wrote this book, but this is where it landed. If rationality is not the metric by which we measure whether someone is the image of God, if just having a body is the measure, then, and it's not morality or relationality or any of the other metrics by which people talk about the Imago Dei, then as soon as the sperm of your father and the egg of your mother met and started to multiply, you were the image of God. There's no
Praise God.
there's no like non-human period. As soon as that joining happened, you're embodied. And so I think that has implications for how we think about the unborn.
I think it has
mhm,
implications for all kinds of things. And I don't mean to cut Michael. It's Mike. I'm going to pass this off to Michael. But like, even when it comes to we're just the shell doesn't matter, that idea
Mm-hmm.
has been so pervasive throughout Western society that,
Yeah.
again, you're talking about being God's image and the embodiment of male and female and that being important. And without like going out of my
Yeah.
way to get canceled on this program, because the last time we talked about this, the live stream was cut. So I'm going to go ahead and try to avoid this subject to the best of my ability. And we will do
Mm.
other content on other platforms that will allow us to do those things. But I could see how even that embodied language, where people
Yeah.
are like going, hey, you know, being male doesn't matter. I can choose to be female and go through whatever surgery is
Mhm.
necessary to do that. And
Yep.
and as a
Yep.
female, I can do whatever I want to become male. And it goes, no, the shells theologically, in the theological ethic of the Christian, we say, well, that's not just a
Mhm.
shell. That has something to do with
Mhm.
bearing God's image, and you ought not to, you know, deform, distort that image because you're created on purpose and with intentionality,
Yep.
and there's
Yeah.
meaning to that physical body that you have. Um,
mhm.
anyway,
Yeah, these
Yep.
are obviously complicated questions, and there's a lot of deeply pastoral concerns in this conversation. Those who are struggling with gender dysphoria or who are feeling trapped in the wrong body, This is no small thing. But it is interesting that we live in a time in which how I feel becomes, or my psychological state somehow takes priority over my physical embodiment. And that's a new development historically. And I think this doctrine of the Imago Dei does have relevance for it because it recovers the importance of embodiment. I didn't set out to write a book that addressed these issues. It just is where I landed because the text took me there. As I rediscovered the importance of embodiment, I realized, oh, this is what everybody's talking about right now.
Hmm. Totally. Carmen, could you talk to us about maybe a potential relational dimension to being made in God's image? So,
Sure.
specifically, in the Genesis account, it's, let the earth bring forth crystals or crystals. Well, that's included in things he created, sure. But
Wow.
creatures is what I meant to say. And let this happen or
Creatures,
let
all right.
that happen. But when he gets to human beings, it's let us create mankind in our own image. And
Mhm.
so some theologians will argue that because there's this personal pronoun here used, us, and of course there's debate, is this the us, the Trinity? Is it the us of the divine plural of majesty? Is it the us of a
Mhm.
divine council, etc.? But either way, wherever we land on that there's some kind of relational element that God is
Mhm.
communicating, that he can relate to his, specifically the creatures made in his image, in a way that is
Yeah.
different and beyond what his other creatures,
Yeah.
their capacity to relate. So kind of the relational side. Do you think that's a
Yes.
thing?
I do.
Yes, you
I
do.
do think we have an inherent potential for relationship with God, that we're designed to relate with God. And I think the place where that's clearest for me is in Genesis 5. So I agree that the let us in Genesis 1:26 also points to that, but I think it gets really clear in chapter 5 when it talks about Adam having a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. And that's right after a reminder that God created humankind in the likeness of God. And what's happening here is, I think, an analogy is being offered, and this goes back to the resemblance question. My mom's here for a visit right now, and my mom and I look somewhat alike, but we're by no means do we look the same, right? We have our own unique characteristics. But the fact that she's my mother and I'm her daughter is an unchangeable thing that connects us, and
Hmm.
we have a certain inherent potential because we're related to each other. And so I would say that every human being is part of God's family, that the Imago Dei implies a kinship with God, which does not mean we all get along well with God, because as in any family, there can be a breach in relationship between parent and child or between siblings or whatever. There is a bond there that if you work at it, you can come back to that place of having a good relationship again. And so, yes, I think relationality is a piece of this, particularly our capacity to relate with God. But if somebody, again, just circling back to what I said before, if somebody's in a coma and we have no evidence that they're communing with God, that doesn't mean that they're not human anymore. Because we hear stories even after someone comes out of a coma of a kind of spiritual connection that they had with God, or we see this in those who are reaching the end of their life, and they don't have the same rational capacities, but they have still a kind of relational potentiality.
Hmm. That's good. You
I,
mentioned in your answer, Carmen, both the image and the likeness when you were talking about Genesis chapter
Mhm.
5 with Seth. Could you talk to us about the
Yeah.
difference or non-difference between image and likeness?
Sure. I think they're used as synonyms. I take them to be synonyms. Tselem is the technical word for a physical statue, but likeness is used in parallel with that. So God created humankind as His own image. Is in chapter 1, verse 27. We have image and likeness side by side in verse 26. I don't see a huge difference between the two. So anytime we see likeness, I think that could be, I think we can, the words are virtually interchangeable.
Okay.
Well, I just, before I ask my question, I just want everyone who's not in the live comments that's watching this video later to go back and look when Michael accidentally said, God told the crystals to be fruitful and multiply. The live comment section
loved
blew
that
up. It
in
was
the
so
chat.
funny. Michael's new age. You know, did he tell the essential oils to be fruitful and multiply too? I mean, there's some pretty funny stuff in there. You guys should go and read it on your own time. Anyway, I love, our audience is so funny. Okay, so let's talk about the fall. I've heard like that Genesis 5, and I'm not saying that I heard this from a ton of reputable scholars as much as, you know, up in my Christian upbringing, I remember being told this, that Genesis 5 changes the order, right? So God was made in his image and then after his likeness, but Genesis 5 says likeness and image. For you, those are synonyms, so it doesn't make a difference. But there is this idea that after the fall, the image is somehow distorted. There's a twisting. That's why those words are switched, is why some would say.
Okay.
But anyway, so there's this seeming distortion in the image of God. How does that affect Christian ethics? Do you agree with that assessment that after the fall, there's something that's been affected by sin, something about the image that's been affected by the sin in such a way that distorts us from that, I don't know, whole image that we had from before? I mean, I even think of a quote from, maybe it's Irenaeus. It's one of the church fathers. He talks about the painting, how the painting of the image has been distorted and there needs to be a new image reprinted, repainted on it. He talks about Christ embodying that new image. And anyway, so walk us through being in God's image. Is there a fall, a distortion of that after the fall?
Yeah, so I've heard the same argument about Genesis 5, that the point is being made there that Seth is in Adam's image, but he's not in God's image anymore. And I think the reason, I mean, for me, the place that this completely falls apart is in Genesis chapter 9, where even after the flood, God tells Noah, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind.
Amen, yeah.
So there's a clear reaffirmation of humans still being the image of God, even after the flood and the fall. And therefore, ethics matter. You can't just take human life. If somebody takes a human life, then they're in danger of having their life taken as a kind of vengeance for the, or a just punishment for the murder that they committed. And so I don't think it works to say that we've lost the image. Lots and lots and lots of people say this, that it's been lost or distorted or destroyed. And I was convinced by a talk I heard by John Kilner back in, I think, 2009 at ETS, that the image was not lost or destroyed or distorted, but that based on Genesis 5 and 9, we see that it's intact. Obviously, something changed in the garden after Adam and Eve's rebellion. Obviously, something has been broken or lost. But I think Genesis 9 convinces me that it isn't the image. So the identity as God's image is still intact. What's changed is there's been a separation between God and humanity because of humanity's choice to disobey. There's now a separation, so that that relationship is hard work. There's separation between Adam and Eve, between them and God, between themselves and the ground. Life gets a lot harder. So the way I would describe it is the image hasn't been lost, but the glory has been lost. The glory that we were meant to exhibit as God's image is diminished. The identity is still there. And you can think of any parent-child relationship that's become estranged to see what I mean. You can never undo the status or identity as parent and child. Once you're conceived, there it is. You are parent-child, and that's irreversible. Even if you are given up for adoption, there's a biological parentage that's irreversible. If the relationship suffers and needs reconciliation, that's something different. It's what I would say is corresponding to that glory that's been lost. It's not working well, but it's still there.
Right. Okay. So I'm imagining somebody who wants to push back on this. Okay, so
Okay.
I'll read a couple of verses, Colossians 3:10 and Ephesians 4:24, and I'll articulate what I think they might say, and then I'd love to hear your response. So Colossians 3:10, we have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge after the image of its creator.
Mhm.
Ephesians
Mhm.
4:24, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness, and so some people are going to look at that and say, well, look, something was lost because
Mhm.
it's only in Christ through the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit and mortifying
Mhm.
the flesh and
Mhm.
so on. We put off the old self, put on the new
Yep.
self, and that it's the new self that's perfectly in God's image. And we have to put on that
Mm.
new self
Mhm.
made in God's image and Christ's likeness, because the
Mhm.
old self is marred, and technically, yes, we're still made in God's image, but they'll use different language: marred, stained,
Sure. Sure.
tainted, defaced,
Yep.
whatever. But Christ came as the perfect God man to sort of set things right again. And in our union with him, we are transformed into his image until Romans 8, where it says that he predestined us to be conformed to the image of his son. So they'll
Mhm.
go to these
Mhm.
kinds of verses to support
Yep.
something was distorted. How would you respond to that?
I would say that the state that we're in is that we're often not living in alignment with our true identity. So, for
Mhm.
generations, we've been living out of a false identity, not out of our true identity as God's image. And so, yes, we need renewal and we need to be brought into alignment and into congruency with our true identity.
Mhm.
And Jesus, because he comes in the flesh as the image of God, he is able to demonstrate for us, to model for us what it's supposed to look like for us to be the image of God. And so yes, we do need restoration, not because the image has been lost, but because we've been living a lie. And so
Mm.
I think the more we become like Christ, the more there's an alignment between who God made us to be and how we're living. And that alignment is something really beautiful. And Christ never lives out of alignment. He shows us this is what it's supposed to be like. But as you've said, these passages that you pointed to, Michael, are often used to make the argument that only Jesus is the image of God and the rest
Mhm.
of us are made in the image of God. There's like a one step removed from actually being the image. And I find that to be a problematic argument. I do have scholarly friends who hold this view, and I respect them and respect their work, but I disagree on this. I don't think that Jesus is the image of God because he's God. Jesus is the image of God because he's human. That's what makes
Mhm.
him, that's what qualifies him as the image of God. And
Mhm.
God doesn't need to be an image of God. God already is God, right? So
Mhm.
Jesus in his deity doesn't need to be the image of God. It's because it's as he becomes incarnate that he becomes the image of God and then shows us, models for us how to live. So I think he becomes like us, not unlike us. And
Right.
I'll die
Okay.
on that hill.
So,
So,
would the
so
illustration of a car, like an old car, work? So like you got a 1969, Corvette Stingray, super dope, and it comes off of the factory line. It's painted, it's beautiful, it's chromed out, works wonderfully. But because of corruption, because you drove around in Michigan and they salt the roads, the car is rusted out from the inside. But if you find it in a junkyard, you can look at it and go, oh, that's a 1969 Corvette, right? Like I know exactly what that is because
Mhm.
it bears an image, it bears a
Mhm.
staple, but that image, like it's not factory new. So it's not like you can say that it has like you can't look at it and say that's a minivan because it's distorted. It still is a Corvette. So in that we
Mhm.
are image bearers, we still bear the image no matter what happens. But can we say that that image is not even distorted because it's not less of a Corvette because it's been eroded in some way?
Mhm.
It still is, but it's not what it could be. It's not. It needs still
Yeah.
to be restored in order to come back to its initial glory. This is a horrible illustration that I'm making up on the spot. Carmen, fix it. Tell me why it doesn't
Um,
work.
I'm intrigued by the illustration because I think you're right that it never ceases to be a Corvette. Like, how many pieces of it do you have to take off before it's not a Corvette anymore? So I think maybe, but what I'm hesitant about is that you could still say, oh, that's a diminished Corvette, or it's a broken
Right.
Corvette, or it's like it doesn't work. So I still want to come back to saying there's
Yeah.
nothing that's been lost at all about my status or identity as God's image. No matter how rebellious I am fully the image of God.
Right. I think would you say this is right? Because in listening to your answer, I think where I see like you're trying to really hold this distinction in what we call ontology, the
Mhm.
essence of humanity. We are the image of God. And then you kind of
Yeah.
create that distinction into functionality, into vocation.
Yeah.
And this is
Yeah.
really where we started the conversation, talking about, mankind's called to subdue the earth. And you're like, yes, but that's really an
Mhm.
expression of his being God's image, and I would make a distinction. It
Yep.
flows out
Yep.
of it, but it's more of a vocation, an expression of being ontologically the image of God, and so to carry that forward into sanctification and holiness, it sounds like you're really just kind of holding consistently to this line that our ontology is in its
Mhm.
essence God's image. And then functionally and vocationally, we were called to holiness and
Yeah.
we got away from that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so Christ calls us back, and that's the sanctification
Yep.
process. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think back to Josh's illustration, maybe it works if we make that same separation between ontology, what make and model of car is this? And then the question of how well does it run is a separate question. And so if it really needs a tune-up and there's no gas in
Mhm.
the tank, then like, yes, it's a 69 Corvette, but it doesn't run well. So it's not able to fully do what it was intended to do, but it still is a Corvette. I think I could work with that. I think
Yeah,
that kind
and
of
the
works.
reason that this is super important, right, is because you don't want to be able to justify crusades. You don't want to be like, because
Right.
I'm a Christian, I'm more God's image than you, infidels, because
Exactly.
y'all aren't really God's
Exactly.
image. Like this, the
Mhm.
the rubber hits the road. See, I'm keeping going with this car
Oh,
illustration.
dude, you keep
Ooh,
it
yeah.
going, bro.
Ding, ding, ding.
It really works, because you don't want to create any kind of distinction where there's more penalty for killing a Christian and less penalty for someone dying,
Yep. Yep.
in infancy or in a drunk driving accident. Well, that doesn't really matter because they weren't really a believer. You
Yep.
don't want in any way to diminish
Right.
Imago Dei language. You don't really want to diminish
Right.
the inherent value that it is to be the ontology of a human, because that very ontology means that you're made in the image of God. So I feel the tension of you going, ooh, I'm
Mhm.
careful about talking about distortion language. I'm careful about talking about losing something in the image, because if you start to do that, you can justify great atrocities in the name of God. And I feel that
Yeah.
tension, and I think that it's
Yeah.
wise to walk that
Be
tightrope. Do you have
careful.
anything you want to
Yeah.
say into that
Yeah.
before I ask another question?
I'm just thinking about the difference between the body of the car and the engine and how it runs. And if we said that it's a mint condition
Guys, I asked
69
this
Corvette.
question to Carmen live on air. Don't hold her to this illustration, but she will be giving a paper at ETS this year on why Corvettes rightly represent the image of. I'm just kidding. Okay, I've got a question about image of God. Are there other created things that bear the image of God? Dr. Heiser seems to suggest that Genesis, let us make man in our image. That phrase is potentially a divine council discussion. And if they are saying, let us make man in our image, that might suggest that angels also bear that image. He calls the Ben Elohim sons of God. And if they're sons, does that mean they're part of the divine family? So can you maybe weigh into angels
Mhm.
bearing that image? And then I've got weird follow-up questions. And I know we're like getting close to the end of the show. And really, this book is really diving into Christian ethics, and we haven't even scratched the surface of some of it. But this isn't part of your book. This is just my weird,
Yeah.
curiosity. Are they made in God's image? And how does that relate to Genesis 6? If these
Yeah.
angels fall and they're having relationships with people that are made in God's image, like those offspring don't seem to be God's image. How does all that work?
Okay, so I agree with Heiser that in Genesis 1, the let us is God speaking to the divine council. Richard Middleton also holds that view. And Middleton also toys with the idea that maybe angels are the image of God, and so we're made in the image of angels as well as of God. I would stop short of saying that. Middleton was kind enough to write the foreword to the book, so we're essentially in agreement on what the Imago Dei is and what it implies. But I think on this point, I'm a little bit more cautious. So yes, there's a divine council. I'm hesitant to say that angels are the image of God for the very simple reason that they don't have an embodied presence on earth that represents God persistently or permanently. They sort of come and go are they in human bodies, or are they apparitions of some kind? Or I don't know how embodied. I don't see them eating. Are they eating and drinking? I guess they eat and drink with Abraham. I don't know. I'll have to think more about it. But I'm very hesitant to say that members of the spiritual realm are the image of God for the precise reason that the point of being the image is to represent God on the earthly realm. Do they image God in some way in the heavenly realm? Maybe. I'm not sure how we would ever know for sure. To the question of Genesis 6, the sons of God and the daughters of men cohabiting, would their offspring be the image of God? I think hypothetically I could say yes, given that they would be, since it's daughters of men, they're being conceived in the womb of a human woman, which means they're born human. And so they might have some kind of other quality about them that makes them unique, but
like being 9 feet tall.
Sure, but they're embodied and they're in a human woman's womb. So that fits the other criteria of
that was
human.
Just Josh pulling the Corvette over into a pit stop and being like, let's pull in Michael Heiser's work.
Wow. You're trying to figure out how to work another illustration.
You see what I did with the pit stop there? Yeah.
I did.
No, that's good. There's so much. For those of you unfamiliar, Genesis 6, the first few verses, it's really weird. And that's what we're talking about. Sons of God, Nephilim, all that kind of deal. And I can't remember what Heiser says about Hebrews 1 and 2. My guess is that he would differentiate between the sons of God and maybe the angels that are ministering spirits in Hebrews 1 and 2, where it's, God doesn't save the angels. He comes as a descendant of Abraham and he suffers and saves the descendants of Abraham. He seems to make a pretty clear distinction there, and ministering spirits are sent to serve those who inherit salvation. So I don't know if he distinguishes between the sons of God, the ruling class of the divine council, and kind of your run-of-the-mill foot soldier angel. I don't know. I can't remember.
Your off-brand great value angel.
Okay, but hey, we have like 5 minutes here, so I'm gonna throw like a grab bag of a couple of questions out here because there's so much more to talk about in your book, and I want to just talk about practical ramifications of the image of God. I want to, whether it be in ethics, whether it be in human suffering or human capacity, and we kind of touched on that a little bit, but just the image of God as it just affects us in day-to-day living. Could you talk through some of those things? And I'd say I'd especially be interested in the ethics and suffering component, but then anywhere else that you just want to throw in there too.
Sure. Yeah, I say in the book that there's something in this book to make everybody upset or to make everybody squirm at least a little bit, because what I try to do is, after building a foundation for what does the Bible say about the image of God, what does it mean to be God's image, then I start to tease out the implications in lots of different areas. So I talk about gender and sexuality and disability and race and vocation and work, human suffering. I talk about eschatology. There is something in here, again, to ruffle everyone's feathers at least a little bit. But what I want to say from the outset is that this book is not meant to be the final word on anything. I'm hoping that it functions kind of like a gateway drug, where you're coming in and you're seeing like, whoa, there's a whole new world here, and I need to think about all of these different things. And so every chapter has a section of recommended resources for digging deeper on that topic. I don't wrap any of these things up in a neat and tidy bow. I kind of open up. Let's have this conversation. So is there something particularly about suffering that you wanted to press into?
Um, Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched it. I mean, I think that there is just the embodiedness of Jesus coming, and you talk some about
Mm,
the incarnation in your book, but just how Jesus
sure.
comes as one who suffered, and so much of suffering is
Yeah.
tied to our embodiment, uh,
Yeah.
and s-
Yeah.
and so just kind of touching on the image of God there a little bit.
Sure. I think that I was really struck as I worked on the book I learned the most in the area of disability. And this relates to the incarnation because Jesus, like all of us, begins his life unable to walk and talk and needing the care of others. And most of us will spend our later years of life dependent on others. And it's only in that center section that some of us are able-bodied enough to be independent. But I talk about
Hmm.
how the biblical ideal is not independence, but rather interdependence. And that if the body of Christ is functioning as it should, then we're all a part of the beloved community and we all have something to offer and something to receive. And so I tease out what might that look like in our churches? What might we need to think about that we maybe haven't thought about in terms of accessibility? For example, does your church have a wheelchair ramp to get in the building? And if so, is it in the same location as everybody else comes in the building, or do wheelchair users have to go around to the back dark corner of the parking lot to get in the building? Do you have a wheelchair ramp up to your stage? And if you don't, what is that saying about what you think about those who use wheelchairs? Do you think they don't have something to offer the whole congregation? They're only there to receive. So that's one example of areas where I'm trying to open up and push for more conversations about how to be radically inclusive to every person who is God's image, which is everyone, no matter their ability, no matter their ethnic or racial background, no matter their social status, their economic, their income, their buying power. All of these things I think are radically redefined in Christ. Christ is trying to take us back to the idea that every human being has equal dignity and worth. And in many, many ways, we are not living like that's the case.
Hmm, that's
That's
good.
fantastic. Carmen, I really enjoyed your book. I'm glad that I was on the short list of people who got early access to it. And I'm kind of rubbing it in the face of everyone else who didn't get it. Anyway, so, both and. Guys, check out the book. I'm going to put a link of it in the description. Go pick it up. This book covers a lot of various issues. It really is an introduction to Christian ethics, but it's written not as like, don't do bad things. It's really interesting, and it's rooted into Christian theology. So I would encourage you to get it. If you picked up the first book about bearing God's name, being God's image is just as good. Give you a couple recaps of what's going on in these chapters. There's a partner in creation, the crown of creation, getting to work, the human project, the human quest, human suffering, Jesus the human, a new humanity, the beloved community from creation to new creation. Again, you're covering all of these various aspects of what it is to be human and all of these different stages of redemptive history. I really encourage people to pick it up. It's a fantastic book. Go check it out. Links in the description. Carmen, thanks again for coming on. We might have to book a part two just because I don't think I asked half of my questions in this interview, but I really appreciate you taking time out of your 6-year writing journey in the commentary on Exodus. So I appreciate you sharing some time with us.
Thanks so much for having me back. It's always fun to talk with you guys.
Excellent. Roundtree, you got any kind of closing thoughts? And I'll toss the same thing over to Carmen as they're walking away. One thing to kind of think about, one thing to meditate on. Michael, do you have something that you'd want to share?
Oh, sure. Carmen, I really like your distinction and your pressing home of just the inherent value of every human, even if they're incapacitated, even if they're in a coma, even if they have a lower IQ, even if they're in some way disabled, even like all the even ifs that we can attach to humanity, we are in the image of God, full stop. And I
Mm-hmm.
just really like that. I think it's special, it's important, and as you say, it has huge ethical ramifications. And I think too, maybe the other thing would just be the importance of embodiment in our culture, in our day and age, where truth is defined internally instead of externally in any sort of way. You have your truth and I have my truth. There is this emerging Gnosticism, even from total pagans, they don't
Yeah.
realize that they're Gnostics, and and I say pagans, like atheists are operating with a Gnostic worldview without realizing it. And the way Christianity values the body, we believe in resurrection. N.T. Wright calls it life after death. In other words, the end of it all. And you talk about this, Carmen. We don't just die and go to heaven. I mean, yes, that heaven's kind of like a 5-star hotel until we get our real home, which is
Yeah.
here, a renewed earth, a resurrected planet, resurrected bodies, and just God's value of bodies, embodiment. It's part of what it looks like to be made in his image. So really thankful for your contributions on that.
Oh, thank you. I
Carmen,
just
same
would
question,
maybe
yeah.
leave. Yeah, I'd maybe just leave people with an idea to gather together a group of people to read the book together. I've tried to write it in such a way that you can do like a 10-week book study together. The 10 chapters are all about the same length. Every chapter has videos from the Bible Project that are attached to it with QR codes, discussion questions. And what my hope is, I think we learn better together. And so I'm hoping that this book will open up rich conversations about meaning, human significance, and will really re-energize your sense of being in the world and what you have to contribute. I hope that people walk away feeling really empowered by this book.
Amen.
Hey, thank you so much, Carmen, again, for coming on the program. Guys, links in the description to check out that book. If you want to support the channel, hit the subscribe button. There are links, top 2 links for PayPal and Patreon. I encourage you to go and do that. And we have other interviews with Carmen, who's come on the show before. So we have the video that we've done on I want to make sure that I get these all right, bearing God's name. And then I've got another one that we did with Carmen on the Psalms and lament literature that was really exciting as well. And then this is, I think, our 3rd installment. Carmen, am I missing one? Is there another one that we've done?
We did kind of like a surprise episode based on Carmen's viral tweet about did David rape
yes.
Bathsheba?
The Bathsheba episode is so good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a good one. Yeah. Anyway, so I'll have a playlist down here if you just want to go listen to more.
That conversation has to
like there as well.
Has to circle back around like every 6 months on Twitter. Did David rape Bathsheba? But anyway, it was an insightful episode.
Our video can keep cycling through too then.
There you go.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, guys, again, thanks for coming on, and we'll see you next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. Central Standard Times. Blessings.